Welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Today, I am going to share a review that few of you saw coming. That's right, I'll be sharing my thoughts about the Dungeons and Dragons 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide from Wizards of the Coast. This 384-page hardcover has been out for a while, carries an MSRP of $49.95. All that said, let's swing on over to the other camera because I've got the Dungeon Master's Guide for the latest edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And regardless of what Wizards of the Coast wants to tell you, this is a new edition. So keep that in mind. I tend to refer to this as 5.5. I know it's officially Dungeons and Dragons 2024, but there are mechanical changes to the rules that makes this a new edition. Now, having said that, as Wizards of the Coast has already pointed out, everything that they've released up to this point is still compatible with 2024. And from what I can tell, that is the case. Probably a little bit of fuss as far as converting some adventures in that, but really nothing to worry about. So a few things I want to mention before we dive on in. First of all, this is not a review copy. I did not receive this from Wizards of the Coast. In fact, if you follow the Gaming Gang channel, the website, my live streams, you know Wizards of the Coast no longer sends me review items because they don't like my unvarnished take on their releases, which is their prerogative. I have no issue with that. So I know a lot of you out there weren't expecting to ever see this review. I wasn't planning on reviewing the Dungeon Master's Guide, even though I did review the Player's Handbook because that was actually the last review item I received from Wizards of the Coast. But I have had a lot of people email or ask me in chat in the live streams, hey, are you going to review this? I'd love to know what you think of the Dungeon Master's Guide because I know you always tell it like it is. So I got to say, I wasn't going to review this, but because of the kind donations of friends of the website and the channel by way of paypal.me/thegaminggang, I went, I purchased the Dungeon Master's Guide as well as the new Worlds and Realms book, which is actually from 10 Speed Press. It's not from Wizards of the Coast. And I will actually be sharing my review of that very shortly also. Important to keep in mind, this is not a review copy, and neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any sort of compensation from Wizards of the Coast or any of their agents to share this review with you. And when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons products, it's important that you know that. And a big shout out to our friends of the Gaming Gang, the Madman, Agile Monk, Joshua Edwards, and Kevin King, just to name a few, for making this review possible. We're also not going to look at each and every page of the book because I don't want to have to deal with the fiasco that surrounded the Player's Handbook. I don't know what the policy is with Wizards of the Coast now as far as sharing video of the contents of their releases. Thankfully, I did not get a takedown notice at all with my review of the Player's Handbook because I didn't share that many pages and I made sure to keep my hands on the pages to block things out. So that is going to be my approach for this review as well. So I apologize if you were expecting to see a lot more interior shots of this book than you're going to get. You will get some, but maybe not as much as you might see in other reviews. Then lastly, on a positive note, stay tuned because I am going to tell you how you can get into the running to win a copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons and Dragons 2024. I promise it'll be easy to get into. And if you happen to watch my videos all the time when I do my giveaways, you already have an idea what's coming. Okay, all that said, let's jump on in. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take a peek at the credits page. And I do want to mention, I'm kind of surprised we do not have more writing credits. I know for a fact, way more people than are getting credit wrote content for this book. Kind of surprised that we are not seeing their names. Of course, there are a lot of folks who contributed illustrations to the book. We do get credits for them. So, of course, we'll give credit where credit is due by taking a peek at the credits page for a moment here. Something else I want to mention before we really dive on in. I'm separating the publisher from the publication. Now, there are a lot of things that Wizards of the Coast does and has done that I do not see eye to eye with on. Now, of course, their drive to make role playing and Dungeons and Dragons in particular as inclusive as humanly possible, I am in lockstep with. I am behind them 100%. But there are things that they've done and they do that I don't agree with. We're not here to discuss that. We're here to take a look at this book, and I'm going to share my thoughts about what's in this book and if this belongs on your shelf. That's it. So keep that in mind. I know a lot of folks who are tuning in probably dislike Wizards of the Coast intensely. We're not going to deal with that. We are talking about the book itself. So just want to make sure you understand that. All right. So first off, we're going to dive on into the first chapter, and it is the basics. So this essentially gives you information about how to master a dungeon, how to be a DM. So we're going to get all the basics, like what does a dungeon master even do? We get some various tips as well. We get information about how to set up a session, how to get ready for a session, how to put a group together. Now, of course, these are just kind of tips and tricks. These are not necessarily rules per se. We will get into new rules later on in this book, but this is just really your introduction to becoming a dungeon master. Now, I do want to mention, as far as the production quality, I do like that the paper thickness is a little bit thicker than what we had seen in the past with some 5e releases. So I do like that. The artwork, we still do have a good number of those slice of life sort of images, which plagued, in my opinion, the player's handbook for 2024. We don't have as much of that artwork in here. We do get a little more action. We get a little more motion. So I do like the artwork for the Dungeon Master's Guide more so than the player's handbook. So we get into our second chapter, which is running the game. And this is really going to dive into various different aspects, such as how to handle the size of your group, what's going to be the best group size for you, how to resolve your dice, how to effectively use advantage and disadvantage, as well as the 3 tenets of modern Dungeons and Dragons, which is social interaction, exploration, and combat. Now, back in the day, back in my AD&D days, the order of those would be switched around. So it would be more exploration, then combat, or maybe even combat and then exploration. And if you're lucky, maybe there was a little social interaction. I actually am a big fan of narrative gameplay. If you follow my videos, I've talked about this quite often, that I am not the sort of game master who wants to sit around for 3-4 hours and devote 75% of that time to combat. Just rolling dice, rolling dice. And when combat does erupt, I have a narrative style as opposed to just, oh, hit, 4 points damage. Because other approaches, I mean, I know a lot of folks out there like just, rolling dice and fighting. That's great. Just not my style. So we will get a good amount of page space devoted to how to properly run Dungeons and Dragons. Now, having said that, it's also important to note that in the Dungeon Master's Guide itself, it's telling you there's no right way to playing Dungeons and Dragons. There is no right style of Dungeons and Dragons adventuring or Dungeons and Dragons sessions. Some people might like the hack and slash. Some people may enjoy a Monty Hall approach to Dungeons and Dragons. Others might just want the social interaction with very little dungeon exploration or dungeon delving and combat. No particular way is the right way, and there is no wrong way. The only wrong way to play Dungeons and Dragons, and this is in my opinion, is if people around the table are not enjoying themselves. If they're not having a good time, then something is wrong. So always keep that in mind. So we get about 30 pages devoted to this. We get information if you want to use miniatures. We get a few pages, 3 pages, I think, if I remember correctly, devoted to that. So I liked seeing that. We'll also get information about encounters and character advancement too. The chapter that will focus on rules is the Dungeon Master's Toolbox chapter, which is chapter 3. Now, one thing I appreciate Wizards of the Coast has done is they've gone the direction that many role-playing game publishers have over the last 10 years or so, and that is to pack the vast majority of the rules that are needed to play and run a role-playing game into their player's handbook. So it is not divided where it's like, okay, the player's handbook is player-facing rules, and then the Dungeon Master facing rules are all in the Dungeon Master's Guide. That's not the case. But this chapter does include loads and loads of optional rules and advice. So we get information about creating various things like creating monsters, creating magic items, creating spells. There's advice on how to create your own rules, as well as designing dungeons and hazards and traps and ways of really putting your own stamp on Dungeons and Dragons at your table. Keep in mind, these rules aren't necessarily essential, reason being because they're very situational. Some of them may never come up at your game table. Others might come up quite often. So we have a lot of bases being covered, and there are a lot of various different angles for you to take a look at in this chapter. So there are really 2 chapters that I would say are the essentials of this book, that are the real selling points of this book that I think Dungeon Masters will get the most out of. And that is this chapter here, as far as the Dungeon Master's Toolbox, and then the treasure chapter, because the treasure chapter is going to have gear, magic items, and so forth. And of course, if you end up picking up published adventures for Dungeons and Dragons here on out, both from Wizards of the Coast as well as third-party content creators, there's going to be a lot of references to those treasures in this book. So keep that in mind. As we continue to flip on through, I do want to also mention, I really like the layout of this. I think the flow of this Dungeon Master's Guide is far better than the 2014 guide. And don't even get me started with AD&D's Dungeon Master's Guide, which was full of really cool, interesting stuff. But I want to talk about a hodgepodge. That is certainly it. So as far as the chapters go with this, we start off with, okay, here's the basics. Here's the basics, okay? Oh, and now here's how do you run the game? Okay, so once you get that information about running the game, now, okay, here's some optional rules. How are you going to make this game your own? How do you design dungeons? How do you design monsters, magic items, so on and so forth? Next up, we actually move into creating adventures. So this will dive on into how to come up with effective hooks. Don't start your adventures with you're all sitting in a tavern and the characters don't know each other. And oh my gosh, that is the worst adventure hook ever. It's right up there with, oh, you're on escort duty for a merchant's shipment. That's not a very exciting hook either. Not as bad as the tavern, though. So we'll get aspects of how to create an overarching theme or plot line, how to create individual adventures and tie them all together. We get some example adventures also. They're really short. They're not even a page in length. And I think part of that is just to kind of give dungeon masters an idea that they don't have to do a lot of prep work to create an adventure. And in some ways, I agree with that. But I also am a firm proponent of having some prep work done as far as, making sure that that adventure is going to be entertaining for your players. I don't tend to find games that are just created on the fly where everything's on the fly. We see this all the time, the advertisements for no prep supplements. Those adventures don't tend to be very memorable. Ask players about that adventure 5 years from now, and I'm guessing that there's not going to be a whole lot that they remember. So, of course, we are going to progress from creating adventures into creating campaigns, creating a premise for the campaign, different sort of genres for your campaign, where to set your campaign. And speaking of where to set your campaign, we also have a gazetteer which features Greyhawk, which of course was pretty much the default setting for advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I will say I was a little surprised that Wizards of the Coast did not go with Mystara, because I just think Mystara tends to be a lot more wide open. Greyhawk, well, at least for advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Greyhawk is kind of a particular sort of campaign setting and maybe not as wide open to interpretation as you would see something like Mystara. But we do get into a lot of page space devoted to Greyhawk. I thought it was very cool. We also even get a poster map at the end of the book, which is going to have the region, which of course is inspired by Darlene's map from the original Greyhawk box set. And then on the other side, we actually get the city of Greyhawk. Now, before I continue, I do want to mention, how can you get into the running to win a copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons and Dragons 2024? I'm going to make it easy. Now, I did get this copy through Amazon, and that is how you will receive your copy if you happen to be the winner. And I got to say, now, granted, I didn't roll a 20 as far as the condition of this book when it showed up, but I certainly did not roll a 1, thankfully. So there were a little dings here and there on this book, but no tears or anything like that, thankfully. And if you order books from Amazon.com, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Damn you, Amazon. You'd think they would treat the books better. You know. Anyway, so you can get into the running by, number one, being a subscriber to the channel. Number two, and there's no way for me to check this, but please do it so you can help appease the YouTube algorithm gods. Give the video a thumbs up. And then in the comments section, I'd like you to tell me what chapter of the Dungeon Master's Guide you feel would be most valuable to you and why. Now, you don't have to write a novella, but I am looking for something more than 2 or 3 words. And then what I will do is I will randomly select a winner from those comments to receive a copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide by way of Amazon.com. And I will reveal the winner on my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, for January 30th, which is a Thursday. So you'll have a little bit of time to get into the running. Moving right along, our 6th chapter deals with the cosmology of Dungeons and Dragons. So we get a bit of a deep delve into the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse. We'll get information about the various different planes. There's discussion about the material plane and Shadowfell and the Feywild. So we get all that information in that. I found it to be a pretty interesting chapter all in all. The largest chapter in the book is our treasure portion of it. It's over 110 pages in length. So we get information about various different themes of treasure. We get a ton of magic items. Once again, I feel that This is one of the two most essential portions of this book because we have got loads and loads of magic items here. I think just by reading through this, I didn't do a direct comparison. I think we get more magic items in this Dungeon Master's Guide than we did the 2014. The entries seem to be a little bit shorter, a little more concise. So I like that quite a lot as well. So as you can see, we have got loads of treasure here, quite a lot of artwork devoted to the various different magic items. But as you can see, lots of page space devoted to this. And of course, there's info about how to create your own items. And then the final chapter of the book focuses on essentially domain play for the most part. Here, it's not a stronghold, it's called a bastion. We have some new rules about gaining a bastion, upkeeping your bastion, adding to your bastion. There are aspects to this chapter I like. I think some of the various different locales that you can add to your bastions, pretty cool. I also like the fact that it's called a bastion. It's not a stronghold because a bastion doesn't necessarily have to be a keep, a castle, a wizard's tower. It could be many different locations. So I do like that. One thing I don't care for, though, is it feels really gamified in a lot of ways. There are various different rules as far as like your bastion turn, things like that. Out of the book, as far as full chapters go, this is kind of the one that I could take or leave. I mean, it's fine. It's all right. I'm sure I would utilize some aspects and then other aspects I would just completely ignore. Then we'll have a couple of appendices. The first one is a lore glossary. And while I thought this was cool, and as someone who's got some experience with earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, especially AD&D, I thought it was nice to see references to famous people and places. I don't really know how useful this will be for newcomers to Dungeons and Dragons because the reality is I think most people will be like, "Oh, okay, that's interesting, but it's not doing anything for my game." So now keep in mind, this is not a chapter. This is an appendix, but I kind of felt this was kind of take it or leave it as well. Then we're going to wrap up with some maps from Dyson Logos. And these maps are pretty nice. They're relatively basic, but as a game master, if you're looking for a map in a pinch, you can have access to these also. And then we finish up with an index and that aforementioned poster map of Greyhawk. And that is a peek inside the 2024 Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide from Wizards of the Coast. Swing on over to the other camera so I can share some final thoughts as well as my review score. As I mentioned in the beginning, I am separating the publisher from the publication because I know a lot of gamers out there, the way they feel about Wizards of the Coast colors how they feel about Dungeons and Dragons. And yes, I don't see eye to eye with Wizards of the Coast. They've got a beef with me. I don't necessarily have a beef with them, but I am not going to allow any of that to influence my thoughts and review score for the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I know folks tuned in. I'm sure there's a few of you out there who are hoping that I was going to hate on this book. And by now, you've probably realized that's not going to happen because I actually really like this book. I think it is a better designed and laid out Dungeon Master's Guide than we got in 2014. It is certainly more logically laid out as far as the progression from an introduction to what does a dungeon master do all the way through to the domain play. So I do like that quite a lot. Production quality, I think, is better than what we've seen in the past, especially with the 2014 editions of the core books. Paper stock is quite a bit heavier, at least by my feel. It does seem to be quite a bit heavier. Artwork throughout, yes, there's still far too much of that slice of life kind of artwork in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Not as much as we saw with the Player's Handbook. It just feels weird to my Dungeons and Dragons sensibilities. Maybe it's fine for your Dungeons and Dragons sensibilities. I'm just saying, I tend to like to see more action related shots, more shots that kind of inspire me as a game master. So I'm just pointing that out. But production quality, all in all, really nice. As far as the content itself, I think there's not only loads and loads of advice and rules to make a dungeon master's life easier. There's quite a bit that's focused on making the game more entertaining for the players around the table. And as someone who has been running role playing games for over 40 years, my goal has always been that my players have a hell of a good time. So when we're done for the evening or afternoon or weekend or whatever, they are chomping at the bit to play more. Now, granted, yes, it's important that the dungeon master has fun at the table. Otherwise, it becomes a real slog running a game. But all in all, I definitely like the advice here to make your players have a better time around the game table as well. I think the vast majority of the information is useful that's included as far as the optional rules and creating encounters and building dungeons and so on and so forth. Really, the only chapter I could kind of take or leave is the domain play, the bastions. There's some stuff that I think is pretty cool. There's other things that I'm like, no, it's just too gamified for my tastes. It's like, okay, well, I would prefer to role play more aspects of the player character's stronghold or bastion, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to just rolling dice during the bastion turn to see what's going on. But all in all, I certainly really do like the Dungeon Master's Guide. As far as if you own the 2014 Dungeons and Dragons, should you pick up the Dungeon Master's Guide? The reality is, I would think if it was a choice between picking up a new player's handbook or picking up the new Dungeon Master's Guide, I would certainly point you in the direction of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Because I think as an experienced dungeon master, you're still going to find a lot of useful and gameable content in this book. Now, of course, if you are someone who's looking into playing Dungeons and Dragons, then I have to say that this new Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D 5.5 is an absolute must-have. So on a score of 0 to 10, I give the Dungeons and Dragons 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide a 9 out of 10. I think it's that good. I enjoyed the hell out of reading this. And I got to be honest, just reading this book really did kind of get my juices flowing to possibly running Dungeons and Dragons, which of course isn't going to happen because D&D isn't my go-to fantasy role-playing game. But still, I was like, yeah, I could see running this, which is, in my opinion, a vastly important aspect of any gaming book. All right, that's it for this time out. If you like the video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell, because it'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. And of course, get into the running to win a copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I will be giving one away, and I will be choosing at random, and I will reveal the winner on the January 30th episode of the Gaming Gang Dispatch. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you very much for watching. Until I see you next time, I certainly hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.